There is a morning that arrives in nearly every honest adult's life when the person in the mirror stops feeling familiar. Not in a dramatic way. The face in the glass is the same face. The hair is the same hair. The small line at the corner of the left eye is the same line that has been there since your early 30s. The clothes hanging in the closet behind you are the same clothes. The mug of coffee in your hand is the same chipped mug from the same drawer in the same kitchen of the same apartment you have lived in for years. But the person inside the face, the one who is supposed to live there, is not arriving the way it used to arrive. You stand for a moment longer than you usually stand. You look. You wait. You expect the small click of recognition that has happened every morning of your adult life so far. The small, almost unnoticed click of, yes, that's me, that's the person I am, let's go. The click does not come. The face waits. You wait. The two of you are in a small private standoff that nobody else in the world would know was happening. You finally turn away from the mirror. You make breakfast. You go to work. You smile at the colleague who says good morning. You answer the question in the meeting. You laugh at the lunch table joke. You do everything you have always done, and you do it well, but you do all of it from a small, quiet distance that did not used to be there. The day passes. Some part of you watches the day pass. By evening, you cannot tell whether you are tired in the usual way or in a new way. By the next morning, you stand at the mirror again, and the click is still not there. This is the experience this video is about. Carl Jung studied it for 40 years. He saw it in patient after patient, almost always between the late 30s and the early 50s, almost always in people who had built lives that, by every external measure, were working. The patient would come to him alarmed. They would describe the experience with embarrassment. They were afraid he would diagnose them with something serious. They were afraid that what they were experiencing was the first sign of breakdown. Jung was clear in case after case that it was not. He believed the moment a person stops recognizing themselves is one of the most important psychological events of the second half of adult life. Most schools of psychology in his era treated this experience as a symptom, a derealization episode, a midlife crisis, a depressive marker, something to medicate or talk away. Jung disagreed in writing sharply multiple times. He thought it was the precise opposite of pathology. He thought it was the moment the inherited self finally loosens its grip enough for the real self to begin coming online. This video is the map. The 5 signs Jung documented as the reliable markers. The dissociation phase that nobody warns you about but almost everyone in the middle third of life goes through. What collapses and what survives the collapsing. The body changes that show up before the mind catches up. And the one thing Jung said matters more than any of the others: what to do when you cannot find yourself in your own life anymore. Let's start with what he actually saw. Most people, by the time they reach their late 20s, have a self. The self is not really a single thing. It is a composite built piece by piece across the first 3 decades of life out of the demands of the family system, the expectations of the culture, the praise and punishment patterns of school and early work, the romantic relationships that taught the psyche which parts to amplify and which to suppress, and a small handful of choices the conscious mind has made along the way that it remembers actively choosing. The composite is functional. It is also, in Jung's vocabulary, inherited. Most of what feels like the personal I at 28 is a structure assembled by external pressures rather than by the deep self of the person carrying it. Jung observed that this inherited self works smoothly for years. It runs the career. It maintains the relationships. It produces the social face. It answers the question, what do you want? With a confident answer that, on inspection in the second half of life, turns out to have been mostly the answer the person was trained to give. Somewhere between the late 30s and the early 50s, the inherited self begins to loosen. The loosening is not a breakdown. It is not a crisis in the sense the culture uses the word. It is more like a slow shift in the load-bearing structure, the way a building, after 50 years, begins to settle in ways that are imperceptible day to day, but visible if you compare measurements taken years apart. The patient does not notice the loosening for a long time. The patient notices the symptoms. The symptoms are what brought patients to Jung's consulting room. They would describe feeling slightly outside their own life. They would describe walking through their days as if watching themselves from a small distance. They would describe a particular kind of unease about decisions that used to feel obvious. Do I actually want this job? Do I actually want this house? Do I actually want this person sitting across from me at dinner? Tall questions they had never had before, asked now in a voice they did not quite recognize as their own. Jung found that almost every patient, when given enough sessions to fully describe what was happening, eventually arrived at the same sentence. The sentence varied in wording that was the same in shape. I don't recognize myself anymore. Jung wrote that this sentence was, for him, the single most important sentence he heard in his clinical career. He took it as the signal that the work had begun. The inherited self was finally letting go enough for the real self, what he eventually called the self with a capital S, to begin moving toward the surface. The patient was not breaking. The patient was, in the most literal sense Jung used the word, individuating. But the experience of individuating in its early stages feels exactly like breakdown. That is the trap. The culture has no language for the difference. So the patient comes to therapy assuming they are sick, and most therapists confirm the diagnosis, and the patient gets medicated for the precise experience that was supposed to be the doorway. Jung believed this misdiagnosis was one of the most consequential failures of modern psychology, and he documented across thousands of pages of case notes the actual map of what is happening when the mirror stops feeling familiar. The first sign Jung documented was the slowest to develop and the most reliable once it shows up. A patient is going through old photographs, a box from a closet, an album from a previous decade. They look at the photographs and they notice for the first time that the person in the photographs is not them. The recognition is not the comforting "that was me 10 years ago" recognition that most people have when looking at old photos. It is a different recognition. It is "that was someone who was using my name and my face." The photographs document things the patient did, trips they took, people they married, apartments they lived in, jobs they held. The events are real, and they remember the events. What they cannot remember when they look at the photographs is being the person doing those things. The person in the photographs feels like a younger sibling or a friend or a character in a novel, someone they know about but are not. Jung saw this experience as the most reliable early marker of the loosening. The reason it is so reliable is that it requires no theory. The patient does not need to read Jung or be told what is happening. They simply notice, in the privacy of the moment with the photo album, that they have become someone the photographs cannot quite contain. The experience is unsettling for almost everyone who has it. The instinct is to push the photographs back into the closet and pretend the experience did not happen. The healthier instinct, and the one Jung recommended, is to sit with the photographs for a while, to let yourself feel the strangeness, to not try to talk yourself back into recognition. The strangeness is information. It is telling you something true about the relationship between who you were and who you are becoming. Most patients, after this first encounter with the photographs, return to them in the weeks and months that follow. Each return produces the same recognition, slightly deepened. The person in the photographs becomes less and less the patient. The patient becomes more and more themselves. The two are not opposed. They are connected. The photographs are showing you, in physical evidence you cannot argue with, that there was a previous version of you that you are no longer required to be. This is the first sign. The second sign Jung documented shows up in conversations. The patient is in a familiar conversational rhythm. A coffee with a long-time friend, a dinner with family, a meeting at work that follows a predictable script. The patient hears themselves saying something they have said many times before. An opinion, a position, a characteristic remark that the listeners have come to associate with the patient over the years. The patient says the thing. The conversation moves on. But internally, something has happened. The patient noticed, in the moment of saying the thing, that the thing did not fit. The words came out fluently, practiced, smooth, indistinguishable from any other time they have said them. but the patient could feel while speaking that they no longer meant it, or they meant it less, or they meant something else and had simply defaulted to the easier sentence because the easier sentence was already loaded in the muscles of the mouth. This is what Jung called the misalignment of expression. It happens when the inherited self loosens to the point that its standard sentences no longer feel like accurate descriptions of what the deeper self is actually thinking. The first few times the misalignment happens, the patient dismisses it. They tell themselves they were just tired or distracted or having an off moment. By the 10th or 15th time, the dismissal stops working. The patient is forced to acknowledge that a noticeable portion of what they are saying out loud to family, to friends, to colleagues is no longer what they actually think. They are running on autopilot. The autopilot was set 15 years ago. The autopilot has not been updated. Jung observed that this stage is one of the most uncomfortable in the entire transition, because the patient cannot simply stop saying the sentences. The sentences are load-bearing in the relationships. The friend expects the patient to think a certain thing. The family has built its model of the patient around the standard remarks. Changing the sentences would mean disrupting the entire social architecture the patient has been maintaining for years. So the patient continues to say the sentences, but each time the gap widens between what they are saying and what they are actually thinking. The widening gap is the discomfort. The discomfort is the signal. The signal is telling them that the inherited self has loosened past the point where it can pretend to be the whole self anymore. This is the second sign. The third sign Jung found most consequential. The patient is at home. Their home. The apartment or the house they have lived in for years. The art on the walls is art they chose. The books on the shelves are books they read. The kitchen is laid out the way they laid it out. The bedroom is the bedroom they sleep in every night. And one ordinary evening, the patient stops in the middle of the room and notices that the entire space does not quite feel like theirs. Not in a paranoid way. They know the apartment is theirs. The lease is in their name. The art is on the walls because they hung it there. But the life the apartment represents, the choices that produced it, the trajectory it implies, the future it points toward, feels suddenly like the life of a person they used to be, not the life of a person they currently are. This experience is harder to dismiss than the photo experience or the conversation experience, because the apartment is constant. The patient cannot put it back in a closet. They have to wake up in it every day, and every day, in some new small way, the apartment confirms that the life it represents was built by a self that has been loosening. Jung wrote that the patient at this stage is in the precise psychological position of someone who has come back to their childhood home as an adult. The home is the same. The patient has changed. The home is too small now, not physically but psychologically. The space the patient now needs is not the space the home was built to provide. The temptation at this stage is to immediately rearrange the external life, quit the job, sell the apartment, end the relationship, move countries, become a new person in a new place. Some of this is sometimes necessary. Most of it is premature. The instruction Jung gave his patients in this phase was specific. Sit with the not fitting anymore feeling. Do not solve it externally before you have understood it internally. The external life will need to change, sometimes substantially, but the patient who acts before they understand is the patient who replaces an old inherited self with a new inherited self and finds themselves 3 years later in a new life that also does not feel like theirs. The work is internal first. The external follows. After the 3 signs have firmly arrived, usually within a 6 to 12-month window, most patients enter what Jung called the dissociation phase. The dissociation phase is the most unsettling stretch of the entire transition, and it is the stretch in which patients are most often misdiagnosed. The experience from the inside is of being a small step removed from your own life. You walk through your days, but you also watch yourself walking. You have conversations, but you also overhear yourself having them. You feel emotions, but you also notice the feeling of them at a small distance, as if the emotion belongs to a person you are observing rather than to the person you are being. This phase usually lasts between 3 and 9 months. Some patients stay in it longer. The duration is not optional and not predictable. What is happening structurally is that the inherited self has loosened enough that the consciousness of the patient is no longer fully identified with it. But the deeper self, the one Jung said was always meant to come online in the second half of life, has not yet fully arrived. The patient stands in the gap. The gap is the dissociation. Most modern psychology has no good vocabulary for this gap. The clinical word for the experience is depersonalization, and it is almost always treated as a symptom. Jung treated it as a passage. He was clear in his late writing that depersonalization without pathology is one of the most common and least understood phases of healthy adult development. The signs that the dissociation is healthy rather than pathological are specific. The patient can still function, work gets done, relationships continue, basic tasks are completed. The patient sleeps. The patient eats. The patient is not in suicidal distress. The patient describes the experience with a strange precision, as if they have been waiting for years for a vocabulary that finally fits. And the patient, despite the disorientation, has a quiet sense that something true is happening, that the unfitting of the inherited self is not an illness, but a long overdue accuracy. In Jung's documented cases, patients who were allowed to stay in the dissociation phase without being medicated or pushed prematurely back into the old self emerged 6 to 9 months later with a different relationship to themselves. The new relationship was not the same as the inherited one had been. The new self was less performative, more grounded, slower to react, harder to manipulate. It was also, Jung wrote, the first version of the patient actually liked. The dissociation is the price. The new relationship to yourself is the gift. The body, during this transition, undergoes changes that almost no public channel names directly. The first change is sleep. The inherited self ran on a particular sleep architecture, the architecture of a person braced for the next day's performance. As the inherited self loosens, the bracing falls away. Sleep deepens. Dreams become longer and stranger. Many patients report, in this phase, the first lucid dreams of their adult lives. The dreams are often vivid enough to be remembered for years. The second change is appetite. Specifically, what tastes good shifts. Foods the patient has eaten for decades suddenly taste flat. New foods, often simpler ones, taste good in a way they have not tasted since childhood. The body is recalibrating its preferences. The recalibration is real, not psychosomatic. The third change is in the eyes. Other people notice this before the patient does. The eye contact softens, not weakens, softens. The chronic vigilance of reading the room for cues falls away. The eyes begin to rest where they are looking, instead of scanning. Friends report that being looked at by you is different now. They cannot name what is different. The difference is that the gaze is finally yours, not the inherited self's. The fourth change is in the voice. The voice drops slightly in pitch. The pace slows. The little upward inflections at the end of statements, what linguists call uptalk, often a marker of unconscious appeasement, fall away. The voice becomes, in the literal sense, more authoritative without trying to be. The voice has stopped performing. The fifth change is in the resting face. The chronic microtension around the mouth and eyes that the inherited self carried, the tension of constant low-grade social calculation, dissolves. The face at rest looks different. The patient sees photographs of themselves from the dissociation phase and notices, sometimes for the first time in their adult life, what their actual face looks like when it is not performing. These body changes are not optional and they are not minor. They are the most reliable evidence available that the transition is real and is happening. The mind can lie to itself about what stage it is in. The body cannot. If the body is changing in the ways above, the transition is underway. If the body is not changing, the dissociation may be a clinical concern worth investigating rather than a developmental passage. I want to close with what Jung said matters more than any of the signs, the dissociation or the body changes. He said the same thing in different language across multiple late letters. The version I find most accurate in translation is this: "This is the instruction. Do not chase the old self. Do not try to feel like you used to feel. Do not look at the photographs from a decade ago and try to become that person again. They are gone. They were never quite you in the first place. They were a composite assembled by external pressures who served their purpose and now needs to be allowed to dissolve. Do not solve the not fitting externally before you have sat with it internally. Do not quit the job in week 1 of the dissociation. Do not end the relationship in month 2. Do not sell the apartment in month 3. Some of those things may need to change. Most of them will tell you, if you let them, whether they need to change or whether the changing self will eventually recognize them again from a new angle. Do not let anyone, therapist, partner, friend, family, convince you that what you are experiencing is breakdown. If your body is changing in the ways named in the previous section, you are not breaking. You are individuating. The two experiences feel almost identical from the inside, and the culture only has language for the first. You may have to be the only person in your life who knows the difference. Do, however, find one other person who knows the difference. Jung was clear that the dissociation phase is the hardest of the human passages to make alone. One steady witness, a therapist trained in depth psychology, a long-time friend who has been through it themselves, a small reading group on Jung's late work, is often the difference between the patient who emerges from the phase intact and the patient who collapses out of fear of what they are experiencing. And then, finally, wait. The new self arrives slowly. It does not announce itself. There is no specific morning when the mirror feels familiar again, because the mirror does not return to feeling like the inherited self felt. The mirror after the transition feels like the actual you for the first time. The recognition that returns is not the recognition that was lost. It is a new recognition. It is built on a different foundation. It is harder to fake and harder to disturb. The arrival usually takes between 9 and 18 months from the first morning the mirror went strange. Some patients take longer, some take less. The duration is not the metric. The metric is whether you stayed honest with the unfitting for as long as the unfitting took. If you are watching this and you have been staring at the mirror for weeks or months waiting for the click that does not come, Jung would want you to know that the click is not what you are waiting for. You are waiting for a different recognition entirely. You are waiting for the version of yourself the inherited self was finally honest enough to let go of so that the actual version could begin to come online. Stay with the unfitting. Stay with the strangeness. Stay with the long quiet work of letting the trained self dissolve so the real one can arrive. The version of you on the other side of this, the one who finally fits the face, is the one you were always going to become if the first half of your life had not been spent fitting someone else's version of you. That person is waiting. The waiting is the work. Before you go, one last thing. If you have stood at the mirror lately and not been able to find the person you thought was supposed to live there, if the inherited self has loosened far enough that you can finally see how much of it was inherited, leave the number 777 in the comments below. In the symbolic language Jung worked with throughout his life, hence 777 marks the moment a person stops chasing the old self and starts letting the real self arrive. The number is private. It is not an opinion. It is just a mark you are leaving on this conversation, so the next person who finds this video knows they are not alone in it. Leave it below. Let it mark this moment. If something in this video found you the way Jung said it would, at exactly the time you needed it, subscribe and stay close. There is more of this work ahead, and you were made for every layer of it. Until next time.